Excellent, thank you so much. Right, okay, so here we are at the Philosophy Club, and this is like epic because we're coming up to the end of the summer, Samhain, 1st of November, which in the Druid calendar marks the beginning of the new year. It's a New Year festival, and colleagues of mine will be celebrating that all over the magical sites of Europe and Britain and Ireland. So Happy New Year to everyone that likes that particular calendar. We've also just celebrated Simchat Torah, which in the calendar of the Jewish readings in the synagogues also starts again. So, it's coincidental, that's also the same synchronicity. And it's the giving of the sacred law, the Torah, that we celebrate at this time. And a couple of days ago we had Ezra here, the universal calendar of saints and sages, who it seems brought the square Hebrew alphabet to Jerusalem and was responsible for the return of the exiles to Jerusalem. So it's very tragic, I think, that Iran and Israel are constantly flexing their muscles against each other. They should be doing biblical and Quranic studies together, in my opinion. And I'm sure the University of Religions and Denominations in Com, where I was a research fellow for a while, would be delighted to host sort of top-level academic discussions about how Israel and Iran can make peace theologically. Talking of which, I'm going to be attending a conference tomorrow at the University of Harvard, online. I'm not going in person, sadly, but I do love Harvard's campus. I've been there. For Ali, regarded by Shias as the real inheritor of Muhammad's revelations, and he was there a lot of the time when Muhammad received his revelations. And there's a very important seminar tomorrow I'll be attending on Ali's relationship with the Quran. And given I've done a commentary on the entire Quran that took me 10 years, and discovered towards the end of that he's the only other person I have ever heard of who had a chronological version of the Quran, which vanished when he was killed. He was assassinated, Ali. And so far as I know, that chronological version of the Quran has never been found, but I'm going to ask tomorrow at the University of Harvard seminar on the Quran and Ali whether it's been found. It's probably in some library in Iran, and this is why I'm so against war, not just it's one of many reasons, but I'm against the bombing of irreplaceable cultural centres like universities and libraries. If Israel and Iran went to full-on conflict, it's horrendous to think of the damage that could be done to priceless artefacts and texts and so on. So please, this is why as a scholar I'm appealing for peace and mediation. And I'm utterly appalled at the way that the libraries and universities of Gaza have been systematically destroyed. This is utterly outrageous. It's exactly like the Nazis did to the Jews during World War II. They confiscated their texts, held them in a huge warehouse, and then destroyed a lot of them. But some of them were recaptured, and they were later repatriated to their places like Czechoslovakia or whatever. There's a very important book about that called Stolen Words, which tells the story of the Nazi destruction of Jewish literature during the war, World War II. So anyway, so there we are. And then I'm also involved in a conference tomorrow of the International Delphic Academy, which I'm coordinating with colleagues, and we're looking at the idea of a European Delphic Games. It's time we had one, because Europe needs to fly the flag of peace. During the Delphic Games, no nation state or polity city-state could be involved if they were fighting. So if Ukraine and Russia and Israel want to come to this Delphic Games, then they're going to have to make peace and at least a truce. So that would be, I think, a useful way of leveraging some peace here. Also to say, it's the end of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which has just taken place in Samoa, and I believe it was a successful conference, and I haven't read the declaration yet. I believe that was issued probably on Friday, and I haven't had time to sort of read that yet, but 54 nations are in the Commonwealth, and they were all there, South Africa, India, and so on, discussing what kind of world we want to live in. And King Charles III was there, obviously, as well. And so that's, let's see what's come out of that. Samoa's a little island state that will suffer from global warming, as will a lot of these Pacific island states. So, we need to focus minds about how we can roll back global warming and rising sea levels. So, and also another thing I've been up to is attending the Scientific and Medical Network this week, youth group, which is called New Paradigm Navigators. And that was exciting to discuss how, the oldies like me, we've grown out of the paradigm of materialism, but there are young intellectuals who are being indoctrinated into it in universities because it's regarded as the sort of dominant or primary mode of philosophizing and thinking. And it's obviously a necessary hypothesis for a lot of science. But are there not parallel hypotheses that can run? Alternatives to crass materialism? And if so, what would they look like? That's what we're looking for. New paradigms, ways of doing science and medicine. So that was an interesting discussion. I'm listening to Gabor Mate's book as well at the moment about new paradigms in medicine that point to epigenetic aspects of disease prevention. That it's not just genes, it's not just the material body, it's the context in which that material body lives, the stresses that we're subject to, stresses directly related to disease. And medicine is beginning to explore this now. Long overdue, I think. That's why I want to call the NHS the National Healing Service, so that we look at causality in the bigger picture. And so that's all been quite exciting. And also, my guest who's been here for a few weeks is also going back now to Britain. So it's her last philosophy club for a while, tragically. I hope you've enjoyed them. Have you enjoyed your time here?
Of course I have, yeah.
Yeah. And you're going back to Brexit Island, the shock of that. I hope it doesn't kill you off with the Plague Island, we call it. But, no, and also I want to thank Roisin for her amazing work on my book, Being and Knowledge. I want to announce the historic news that it is now fully transcribed. This is going to be a 2,000-page work, only 2 volumes of which have been printed so far. And this took me, 7 years of intense work. When I was full-time teacher, I'd come home at weekends and evenings and work on Being and Knowledge. And then I completed it when I moved to France. And I discovered a French philosopher, lived not far from here, Beaufret, who was introduced Heidegger to France. And I thought that was quite a good blessing on Being and Knowledge, because obviously Being and Time was his great epic, and mine is intended as a sequel to that, and also Sartre's Being and Nothingness. So I hope my work will be studied avidly by the next generation of philosophers when they're sick to the teeth of Being and Time and Being and Nothingness, and then they alight on this work, which I think should relight the spark of philosophizing across Europe, and that's the plan, and across the world, I hope. And there's whole sections on ethics, there's sections on metaphysics, and then it ends up looking at art, and it ends up focusing the huge section on science, obviously knowledge and science. There's a whole section on philosophy of science, but it ends up looking at knowledge and history, which is, paradoxical. What is historical knowledge? How valid is it? And then it finally concludes, part 15, is a huge section on being, knowledge and peace. And of course, as coordinator of philosophers of peace, the whole point of the work, this is like a Beethoven symphony, it ends in the climax of being, knowledge and peace. And I'm arguing in the book I argue there are certain types of knowledge that shouldn't be pursued, like weapons of mass destruction. Sometimes humanity has to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We have to somehow moderate our desire to acquire surplus knowledge, which can be misused. And we have to acquire the knowledge of goodness. So anyway, and peace, which is utterly neglected in our universities. So this book is a massive epic call to reorientate academia and intellectual life and philosophy away from war and materialism, which is now the AI paradigm, and to orientate it towards peace. And to ask, well, what would that look like? What if Britain and France, actually realised Brexit was a silly idea and actually we want a peace treaty again? And what if Russia and Ukraine decided to make peace? What would that look like? We don't have the language for it. We don't know. I'm suggesting that we could use AI to work this out, because the logical complexities of, say, a Russia-Ukraine peace deal are so complex. They involve different territories of Ukraine that have been carved off and invaded, different wills that are clashing, Putin's will to control his internal enemies and protests. There's the economics of this. The economics of the war against Russia are catastrophic. I've just read words from a professor of economics who used to teach in Russia, who says it's costing trillions to maintain this unwinnable war, and the Russian economy cannot sustain that. That's why he's gone to North Korea for this. But how sustainable is that? Does Russia really want North Korean troops to kind of come up in that war? What would that look like? So all these things can be factored into an AI peacemaking decision tree, in my opinion. But we don't have that yet. I think we need to develop it. So anyway, that's the work, being and knowledge. And of course, it's premised on the preference of being to nothingness. I've solved the problem of Sartre. We prefer being to nothingness. We don't want the world to be destroyed into nothingness. And this is the choice that we all have to make. It's an existential choice. Do we want to live or die? And it's confronting us in the notion of suicide of the planet, collective omnicide, as John Somerville called it, the philosopher who founded Philosophers of Peace back in the 80s, which I have worked with for many years. So anyway, Being and Knowledge, thanks to Rasheen, is now about to be published. So that's exciting. It'll take about 6 months to edit it, because it needs some fine tuning, because when things come out of Chat GPT or whatever we're using, it then needs editing. Okay, and then the last thing I say before we go to general discussion is I'm working on my 99 Names of Peace, which is my next epic book. There's always sort of backlog of. So the last epic book was the commentary on the Quran and the Being and Knowledge. Now those have been fully transcribed, thanks to my guest here. And now I'm working on the 99 Names of Peace. And I've been doing languages this week, which included Etruscan, I mentioned last week, but also Russian, Kyrgyz from Kyrgyzstan, and Yiddish. And I found Yiddish absolutely fascinating when I was doing it. I mean, I've always known about the existence of Yiddish, and it's really important in the history of Jewish-speaking people in Europe and so on. Yiddish is a form of German that was spoken by the subculture of German Jews, but also in Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe, in Austria and Switzerland and so on. And Yiddish has a really rich history going right back to Elias Levita, who was one of the first great writers in Yiddish, apparently, in Italy. And he was a Kabbalist who was an advisor to the Cardinal Egidio, the Roman Catholic cardinal, who was the greatest Christian Kabbalist of the day. And I'm in the middle of trying to write a play about all this. Anyway, he was the ancestor of David Cameron, the former Conservative leader. I think probably the last vaguely intelligent Conservative leader there'll ever be. Anyway, it was interesting, he was a descendant of him. And, but so, ever since then, that was the Renaissance time. Yiddish has been a feature of German, Jewish intellectual life, and in Poland and Ukraine. And what I discovered to my horror is that 85% of the Jews wiped out in the Holocaust, 85% of them were Yiddish speakers. So the ones that were rounded up in Poland, Ukraine, Germany by the Nazis and then killed were Yiddish speakers. You know, what was it that they didn't like about Yiddish? It's a very rich literature, and it's Kabbalistic to the core. These great sages, particularly Baal Shem Tov in the Ukraine, were in the box of Kabbalistic Judaism, which is in the periodic table here, and you'll see it in number 96. Estimated about 5 million practitioners now, but an awful lot of them died in World War II, as documented by Tim Snyder in his work, The Bloodlands. I've also discovered the richness of Yiddish literature this week, and an amazing intellectual that I have to say I'd never heard of, the greatest novelist regarded of Yiddish, who was he was called the Unknown One. He took a pseudonym, Der Nister, the Unknown One, and he wrote a kind of huge 3-volume novel in the style of Brothers Karamazov about the Jewish families of the Ukraine over 100 years and their lives and interwoven destinies. And it's all based on the Kabbalah. This guy was an esotericist, and he wove it into the plot. I can't wait to read it. It's been translated into English. This guy was born in the Ukraine. He ended up living and working in Germany, in Berlin for a time, and he was teaching philosophy and mysticism and so on. He was a friend of Art Chagall, the painter, who also spoke Yiddish. And then he opted to go back to the Soviet Union. He thought he'd give them a try. He trusted, the Russian Revolution, and he published some of his work. And then it fell foul of socialist realist censors under Stalin, and he was accused of anti-patriotic literature. And so he knuckled down and just wrote normal kinds of epic stories about heroic workers in the factories. But it wasn't enough. His great novel was published, and eventually he was arrested and purged. So Der Nister, I think, is, I'm determined to read it now as an homage to him.
What was his name?
Well, his pseudonym, Der Nister, D-E-R, and then N-I-S-T-E-R. He was actually called Pinchas Kachavovich, but just put in Der Nister and he comes up. And he was a philosopher and the greatest writer of Yiddish. And, ironically, he perished in Stalin's purges. I think the Yiddish community were getting it from both Stalinism and Nazism, as the amazing work Bloodlands by Tim Snyder reveals. So I've also discovered other things, because I was born in Montreal, which is the 3rd biggest Yiddish-speaking city at the time. And most of the Montreal Jews that were friends with my mother, and who were on the left politically, a lot of them were communists, were speaking Yiddish. And Leonard Cohen's ancestors were Yiddish-speaking. He himself spoke Yiddish, and he was from Montreal. And so was Bob Dylan's ancestors. These are 2 musicians that mean a lot to me as a musician. And they're both from the Yiddish community. They emigrated to the Americas. So I just lament and feel sad about this mass killing of the Yiddish people. And now it's interesting, the politics of this, because in Israel, when the Zionists wanted to recreate Israel, they decided to make it Hebrew-speaking. And there was a big quarrel between the Yiddish-speaking Jews who said, no, that's an old dead language. We speak Yiddish now. It's our living language and has been for 500 years. And the Yiddish community keep Hebrew for religious matters. They read the Bible in Hebrew and they use it for ritual and prayers, but they speak every day Yiddish. And a lot of the first wave of immigrants into Israel felt that should be the language. And there was a battle, it's called the Battle of the Languages, as the Zionists basically won and clamped down on Yiddish and said, no, you're going to speak Hebrew. and forced the children of Israel, all schools, to teach Hebrew. And this has become the language of mainstream, Zionism. What's interesting is that the Yiddish-speaking are the most religious of all the Jewish communities, the Hasidim, or Haredi, and they're the ones that are opposing Israel's military endeavours. They're the ones that hold up, placards in New York saying, "Not in my name." They're the peace movement in Israel, who are the Yiddish speakers, who never wanted this project of Zionist enforced Hebrewism to decimate, a region that they were there really as guests. The Jewish Haredim believe that they should live in peace with the Palestinians. So that's interesting, and I've been researching all this week because that has bearing on, the geopolitics. And the point of the book, 99 Names of Peace, is to look at the role of language in relation to peace and conflict. And it comes up. Just to give another example, I'm doing the language of Lakota. Lakota is the language of the Sioux. And I've always loved the Sioux Indian, ever since a boy growing up in Canada. We were taught that the Indians were the nobles of North America as children. And years later, when I went back to Oklahoma and taught in a seminary for a lot of American Indians were there, they taught me the meaning of the word Bataquiasin, which is "there are men." It's a Sioux phrase, and it means we're all related, we're all relatives. I pray to Great Spirit often, which is the Sioux term, Wakantanka. And, I think we have tremendous amounts to learn from these Native American sages, wisdom keepers, and so it's been fascinating studying the language and looking at their words of peace and so on. But language has become a huge, even in Sioux and the Pine Ridge Reservation and elsewhere, the politics of who controls the orthography, how should we write down Lakota, has become a huge political football with different factions saying, we want it done this way, we want it done that way. And then others say, no, it's our holy language, it shouldn't be written down. It's an oral thing. And that I think what I believe is that it should be decided by the tribes themselves how it should be written down, not by linguists who come in from the outside and imposed, this is a rational way of doing it. It should be the tribes decide if they want it written down, and if so, how. So there's lots of things to do with the politics of language that I'm uncovering in this research, and I'm now doing Macedonian and Bulgarian, which is another big frontier where who defines what is Macedonian language. It used to be called a dialect of Bulgarian until Macedonia self-identified as a separate state in Yugoslavia, and then they decided they were a separate language called Macedonian, which the Bulgarians don't accept. And it's interesting, this language story. So so that's all ongoing. Mon Dieu. And I'm reading also a book about the Protestants of France, about the Huguenots, and also lamenting the long civil wars here in France and the fact that they couldn't reach a religious peace treaty, and that Louis XIV had to revoke the Treaty of Nantes, and it led to all kinds of bloodshed, the revolt of the Camisards. And I think Protestants and Catholics have far more in common than not. And one of the reasons I think the British way is at least we've kept the peace religiously for quite a while, since probably 1688, when the Bill of Rights was written, and there was a sort of general agreement to go the moderate path in religion. But anyway, up until Brexit, that seemed to work. After that, it's anybody's game what happens, because that's when extremism got back into the body politic, it seems to me, in a sad way. So that's a little report on what I've been up to this last week as we come up to Samhain. Any questions or comments or feedback? I'll just say, I just want to give a plug to this. I've also been having interesting conversations about feminist theology with my guest here, and biblical criticism. And when I was a young man in my 20s, I discovered this book, The Paradigm Papers, by Merlin Stone, and it really, really influenced me. I think it's a classic if you're interested or befuddled or confused about gender and religion, and is God a goddess, or is the goddess, bisexual, or what's going on here. This is the book to read, the single most important book on feminist theology. It's called The Paradigm Papers. It's in print as a paperback. And I read it in about 1981 and gave it to all my friends, my mother, my sister. They all got it for Christmas that year. And this is the copy I gave to my mother, Come Back to Me, which was jolly good. So, so that's been interesting. And this, by the way, another plug, is my mother's autobiography, Eileen Daffern. She used to go to Crete every summer for 20 years. I'm convinced she was a reborn Cretan priestess because she loved Crete. She just lay on the beach and went to the tavernas and met all the locals and became an honorary citizen of this little village town called Palliahora in the far south-west of the island. And it's the most southerly part of the whole European continent, which I think is maybe symbolic. And one year I was allowed to go with my mother and sister and slept in an olive grove and wrote a whole bunch of poems on Crete and the mysteries. And so, thank you, Eileen. This is my mother's testimony. And I said at the time, make it bigger because it's too thin. It's only 230 pages, and you can't sum up a life in that. And I asked my mother, please put more detail in. And she was a very humble woman, actually. And she said, no, nobody will be interested in the details. So she never did, which is very sad. And I would love to flesh it out. We can make it twice as long. Because I've got all her diaries and postcards and notes of her later political campaigning and peace campaigning. She was very active in the anti-nuclear weapons movement for 30, 40 years. And we've got all those files. But I don't have enough time in the day to do the second edition. If anyone wants to come and help, that would be great. Okay, shall we finish there then? And let's go on to let's choose our periodic table for the day. Well, for the week, actually. So which one are you going to go for, Amel? Have you chosen?
I'm focusing on the BRICS at that time. And I want to know more about countries like China or India. And so the question of which one to choose about China, for example, with reading the figures, Maoism is very little.
Maoism. Yeah, that's
very little.
Yeah, sure. Tiny one. Yeah.
So Confucianism or Taoism, much more.
Yeah. Well, choose one of those. Yeah, that's not Maoism. That's not named after Mao Zedong. Maoism is named after Mo Tzu,
okay.
who's a Chinese philosopher.
Okay.
Who's a small following.
Ah.
Yeah, Maoism would be in the Marxism box, 72.
Okay.
You can have that again. I mean, we had it last week, but we didn't. We could do Chinese Marxism if you want, and Korean.
Yes, please.
Should we do that?
I mean, as we established, Mao isn't really a Marxist.
Well, there is that. I might share that. Yes. So we'll do 72 again. We'll repeat. And which one are you going to go for, Rashid?
Maybe Santeria.
Should we Santeria?
Yeah.
Number 103. Okay. That's interesting. Right. Well, now let's do. Which should we do first? That is a very exciting question. I want to find the book that goes with this. Can anyone see my periodic table textbook? Is it on the table now?
Black cover?
I don't think so. It is. Well, don't worry. If we can't find it, we can't find it. It seems to have done umbrella. Oh, here it is. There we go. As ever, when you surrender and give up looking, then it turns up. Yeah. Well, okay. Let's do Marxism first. Number 72. Again, and we'll focus on East Asia because that's interesting. So, as I've said to colleagues, the most important thing I can contribute to this is having read a very detailed study of Mao Zedong, and just recently finished one of Pol Pot, in which I learned an awful lot about the history of Marxism in Cambodia, but also Vietnam and Laos as well. And so I've got a real understanding of how Marxism was misapplied, in my opinion, in Southeast Asia, and also I think in China. When I was doing the Universal Calendar of Saints and Sages, I've put in a lot of, some Chinese communist intellectuals. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party was around from early on, and it was founded by some great intellectuals, people that went on to found academic institutions or teach at the University of Beijing, and will be the librarian there. I think the founder of the party was a librarian at the University of Beijing and a scholar. But Mao wasn't, and the problem is, Mao, if you read a detailed political biography of Mao, as I've done, he was not a particularly bright student, and he became early on a nihilist, philosophically. Not a Marxist at all. And many years later, he basically confessed he'd never actually read Marx. I'll come to that in a minute. His philosophy was nihilism, pretending to be Marxist. And the reason he wanted to be a nihilist was because it preached a version of destructivism. So if you smash and destroy the old system, Mao never grew out of that. And he meant it literally, brick by brick, house by house, human being by human being. He would kill and destroy everything that old China stood for. There must be psychological reasons behind such an attitude. I find it appalling that anyone could ever think that, or that that's what revolution entails, or that somehow is a good thing. Marx himself never thought that. Marx felt that communism was the highest flourishing of society, the goal to which history is tending, and it would arise out of the presently existing capitalist system of Europe in the 19th century, which he recognised had done some good in the world, had increased, in some ways, spreading education, all kinds of things. So he felt that the defects of capitalism had to be, done away with, and that capitalism itself could be turned into a constructive, positive force, which he called communism. And he thought this would be like an intellectual shift as we grew out of the negative impacts of capitalism. Now, Marx thought like that, and he was quite happy to play, that role in Hampstead, where he ended up living in London, as the grand old man of, the theory of revolutionary change. But Mao never read him, didn't understand any of that, and adopted it because it seemed like a destructivist manifesto. And what Mao then did was he identified with the peasant poor and became their bandit chieftain. What I learned from my detailed study is that